Hello and welcome. In this webinar, we're exploring the new Staying Safe from Suicide guidance published in April 2025 by NHS England. The guidance marks another vital shift away from suicide risk prediction to something more human and compassionate. My name's Bianca Romanyk. I'm the CEO of Storm Skills Training. I've had the great privilege to record a number of conversations and presentations with various people involved in the writing of the guidance, in that academic research that sits behind or underpins the guidance, and also those with lived experience and others working in the field to prevent suicide. Our first guest is Philip Pirie. Philip co-chaired the Staying Safe from Suicide Guidance Writing Group. He's a bereaved father campaigning to change suicide risk assessment practice. He's been kind enough to share his time, the story of his son Tom, his passion. I think you'll agree that he provides a pretty compelling reason why we need to change practice. Thank you, Philip.
I'm going to talk about the case for change, which underlies the new NHS England guidance, Staying Safe from Suicide. I was co-chair of the group which wrote this guidance. Okay, the case for change. For me, this is very, very simple. This was my son, Tom. Tom took his own life in 2020. The day after he'd been assessed as low risk of suicide by his counsellor. At first, I thought Tom was one of the unlucky ones, one of the few who'd been wrongly assessed. But I was utterly shocked to discover that Tom was not the exception to the rule. Tom was the rule. Of the 17 people who take their own lives every day in this country, 5 of them are in contact with mental health services, and 4 of those 5, that is 80%, are assessed as low or no risk of suicide at their last contact. The 4 and the 5 are the so-called low-risk paradox. I felt very angry when I learned that this low-risk paradox had been known about for over 25 years, and so little seemingly had been done about it. That's when I started my campaign for the reform of the system of suicide risk assessment. I didn't want to stand on the touchline criticizing the players. I wanted to see if I could up my game, try and get on the team, and perhaps help score some goals. So I'm extremely grateful to my co-chair on the writing group of the guidance, Dr. Adrian Whittington, for putting me on his team. Tom's suicide risk assessment consisted of 3 crude questions. Question 1, do you have suicidal thoughts? Tom answered yes. Question 2, do you have any intentions to take your own life? Tom answered no. Question 3, do you have any plans to take your own life? Tom answered no. On the basis of Tom's answers to these 3 crude questions alone, he was consistently assessed as low risk of suicide. Now, here's the first thing. There is absolutely no evidence supporting the validity of this type of checklist. Secondly, many mental health trusts and private sector organizations have actually required their mental health practitioners to use this invalid test. Thirdly, attempts to predict suicide, including suicide risk stratification, are wrong over 95% of the time. Finally, many training organizations, colleges and universities have taught this invalid test. And there are undoubtedly some organizations still using this kind of checklist today. At a conference in Leeds just over a year ago, I asked for a show of hands from the audience of mental health practitioners if they were aware of this type of checklist still being used. Nearly half of them put their hands up. The first thing that struck me when I learned about this type of assessment being used to assess Tom was that it makes a huge assumption that the patient is going to answer openly and honestly. Knowing Tom, it would have been a huge deal for him to seek professional help. He was probably feeling very scared of the unknown, including fear of being sectioned, and wanted to feel his way to see when he felt comfortable enough to open up. So to expect a frank and truthful response from him to a very personal set of questions from a complete stranger is, to my mind, extremely implausible. The guidance Staying Safe from Suicide is fully compliant with NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and it is supported by evidence. It applies across the whole mental health sector, the NHS, the private and the voluntary sector. This is a first. Suicide prediction is fundamentally flawed, and that includes stratifying risk into low, medium, or high. The reason for that is because suicidal impulses can be very, very changeable. You can feel fine 1 minute, and literally 10 minutes later, you can be in the depths of despair. Triggered perhaps by a phone call, a piece of music, or maybe something completely unidentifiable. That is why it is wrong to try and put a fixed label on suicide risk of an individual, because things can change so quickly. Risk factors, such as physical illness, are different and will rightly inform practice. But it is wrong to predict suicide risk and to stratify suicide risk, which is a form of prediction. 300 years ago, it was common practice for doctors to bleed patients, and no doubt they gave serious thought in assessing how much blood to bleed: a low level, a medium level, or a high level. We know now that you shouldn't bleed the patient at all. It is bad practice. Well, fast forward to today, and we know now that we shouldn't try to predict suicide risk at all. It is bad practice. And this is what NICE has been saying since 2011. But perhaps we should turn the clock back a little bit. I've been told several times that the guidance harks back to the days when the key objective of the practitioner was to build a therapeutic relationship with the patient. I will never know if Tom would be alive today if his practitioner's approach had been different, person-centered, focused on building trust and building a therapeutic alliance, and not reliant on superficial checklists. But the evidence for the best practice principles in the guidance says that he would have had a better chance. Thank you for your attention.
Philip, thank you so much for your time.
Not at all,
And
my
your
pleasure.
story.
And best of luck. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Bianca, you're doing a great job there.
We're doing our best. Thank you, Philip, and I'm sure we'll all continue to do our best. The next segment is a conversation between myself and Seamus Watson. Seamus has a long history of leadership within mental health, justice, and children and family services. He's now the National Improvement Director at NHS England and Programme Lead for the Staying Safe from Suicide Guidance. I talked to Seamus about the development of the guidance, steps being made towards implementation, and we talk about some of the successes and challenges so far. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. It's very nice to meet with you.
Hi, good to see you again, Bianca. Hi.
Hi. So you were part of the working group that developed, the writing group that developed the guidance. Can you tell us a little bit about how the guidance came about?
Yes, it's come from quite a few places, Bianca. So we had quite a few things happening all at once. Some was over the past 3 or 4 years when we had quite a few practitioners out predominantly in mental health trusts saying they wanted to move away from stratification and trying to predict risk of suicide and wanted to develop something within their own organizations. What we tried to do is hold that network together, and within the network, at least 3 of our mental health trusts in early 2024 actually moved away from predictive tools and stratification towards a much more person-centered approach to engagement, formulation and safety planning. So we had all of this happening for the past 2 or 3 years. What we've been doing all along was recognizing that we didn't want to do this work alone, so we kept on engaging with NHS England, and they were positively supportive of us around summertime last year, around July last year, when we got the go-ahead from NHS England to sit down to bring the right people together and write the best practice guidance. In the middle of all of that, there was a lot happening around us because we had the nice guidance itself. We had the National Suicide Prevention Strategy arrive. We had an audit from the Coroner's Office, and we had the Health Service Safety Investigation Branch, all reporting back saying we need to be moving away from stratification and prediction. So it was in that quite broad context, lots going on. A few of us decided to hold it together, engage with NHS England, and then got a commitment last July time to write best practice guidance.
Fantastic. And what was the process? I've heard on the grapevine there was a fair bit of consultation that went on there. So tell us a bit about that process, Seamus.
Yes, we did end up with a lot of people. It started really with 3 of us, with Philip Pirie, who we've met already, with Adrian Whittington, who's the clinical lead for psychological therapies at NHS England, and myself, who've been quite active in this bigger network. So the 3 of us met and we tried to get a plan together as to how we would proceed to produce national best practice guidance. We wanted to do it well, but relatively quickly as well. So what we had to do then was decide who we needed to engage with. And we, from the very outset, we were wanting to engage really positively and well and properly with people with lived experience. So we put quite a bit of commitment and energy into trying to make sure we had the voice of people with lived experience. And we had some experts join us from NHS England who are supporting in a number of work streams, but they agreed to align with us. We then had to cast a wider net to think, well, who else has a view here? So we engaged with our national academics and with national clinical leads as well, all trying to get the right mix. And our 3 early implementers, So we made sure we had good representation from people who'd actually done it maybe a year previously. So that brought together 50 or almost 50 people.
Wow.
And what we still felt is that we needed broader engagement still. So we engaged them with an additional 70 people. And it was people with lived experience again, practitioners, academics, people who are really interested in what we were doing around suicide and assessment, and some more broadly interested in broader issues around suicide prevention. So we had a lot of engagement. We were very fortunate that we had the network up and running already. So we had this broad community of practitioners and academics sort of cooperating, supporting each other for about 3 years prior to sitting down and meeting to write the document. So we moved into that community and asked for volunteers, for interested people, and then got our first 50 and then our additional 70 people from that pretty broad mental health community.
So really a culmination of lots of different things coming together at once. And most fascinatingly, I think, is that idea of bringing together so many people who care and want to make a difference, and listening to academics, to practitioners, but most importantly, I think, is those with lived experience, those on the receiving end of these conversations. So nice work. So the guidance has been out for about maybe a month, if that, a few weeks by now. By the time we publish this, it will certainly have been out for about a month. What's next? What does implementation look like? What do services and organisations and private practitioners need to be doing?
Yeah, and that's quite fascinating, because some people have started this journey ahead of us, and fair play to them. They've from their own commitment and energy and knowledge, they've actually started the journey before the guidance landed, before it was published. So what we have to do now is just be mindful that our system, our people are at very different stages now, but we have had things come through consistently as well. So when we're talking with people now about implementation locally, people are saying they've actually had to start with a local audit, a local stock take of what's happening within their own area of practice. So that's been happening a lot. People are just saying, actually, what's happening in our own field of service. Quite a lot of people looking at their training and development programs as well, just checking that we're supporting practitioners in the right way, to be person-centered, to be holistic, to be broad in their approaches. Quite a few organisations have engaged locally with the coroner's office.
Okay.
It's really, really important conversation around how practice is changing, and that conversation is partly about engaging, but it's also sort of working with the coroner so they have an understanding of what best practice looks like in 2025, and through the coroner's process they can be asking the right questions for sure, but delving into assessment and formulation in line with staying safe from suicide guidance. So we've had quite a bit of local engagement of coroner's offices along the way. Quite interestingly, some of our record systems, digital record systems included, haven't been helping us in the past. They've been almost squeezing people towards stratification and predictive tools and predictive decision making. So for a lot of trusts, they've quite assertively engaged with their digital records and their companies that organise records for them to take out stratification and prediction and put in much more space for a narrative understanding of what's actually happening around the individual. So quite a lot of engagement around record keeping. Along the way, we've had some good local engagement of service users and families as well. So we've had quite a lot of organisations saying, just as we try to do nationally, what does this look like locally? So making sure that they don't start that journey by themselves. Local implementation, we learned a lot from those early implementers, and quite a lot of them had to work with their executive boards to engage with the board and again support, educate and steer the boards away from expecting stratification and predictive to actually the assessment might might take a bit longer than previously because we're not asking people to use tools, but we are expecting people to keep in alignment with staying safe from suicide. So some board engagement to make sure that the board is aware and is going to be supporting processes and teams along the way. We had some really sort of reminders from our practitioner community that practitioners have to feel safe in their practice as well.
Absolutely.
And that does apply to suicide formulation and assessment and safety planning, but it's something that applies to all areas of practice. So we had to be mindful that for clinicians and practitioners, it can be quite a stressful job, a stressful thing to do. So making sure the environment is supportive around clinicians and teams. And that's one of the areas where we felt as if we were engaging with the boards as well to make sure that.
Yeah. And I mean, boards are there to make sure that they're providing a supportive environment, but also managing risks. And I imagine that that's quite a large shift for them to go from this way of viewing risks, as you might at that organizational level, which is stratified perhaps, to something a bit more person-centered and narrative. So I imagine that's not an easy shift for organizations or for those perhaps on the front lines. So yeah, what in particular is helping those, I guess, boards to understand the need for change?
I think it's been the combination that's driven the whole process. It's been the combination of when we're listening properly to people with lived experience and their families and trusted others, it's when we've heard their voice about what previous experience has been like and how they want things to improve, unbelievably powerful. So when that voice comes to board, very, very powerful. Supported by professional leaders, people from the professions that actually are doing assessments and safety planning day in, day out, people from psychological therapies, from doctors, from nurses, occupational therapies, allied health professionals. So when that combined service user expert voice combines with practitioner voice, it becomes one that boards find very, very hard not to listen to.
Yes, brilliant.
So we get that great coming together.
Lovely, that coming together, a force in numbers, power in numbers, isn't it? It is quite convincing, and I think we've seen earlier today the power of story that we've seen from Philip Pirie, and that is, or I should say Philip Pirie, that is really important, the power of personal story. So you've mentioned one challenge there in terms of record keeping, squeezing practitioners into stratifying risk levels. What other challenges are out there?
Yeah, the other challenges that I've sort of found myself with trying to program lead the work itself and the things happening around it. Keeping the multidisciplinary approach, Bianca, hasn't been straightforward. It's taken quite a bit of effort to make sure that we were talking in a way that is about all practitioners, all qualified mental health practitioners. So that still takes some effort to make sure that we don't fragment into a nursing conversation or a medical conversation or a psychological therapy conversation. So holding the MDT together as one is still something that we've had since day one, really, but we still have to persevere with it. We've got some particular engagement around social workers currently, so making sure that social workers did contribute to it, but we have a bit of catching up to do in terms of implementation and social care now. But we have got some engagement sessions lined up over the coming weeks with senior practitioners and academics in the social work community. So we still have that to do. There is a challenge in the system as well in terms of the interface between primary care, sort of GP care and primary care, and sort of mainstream mental health services. So some of the feedback we've had from primary care is that they are sort of pushed towards stratifying risk when they refer people to mental health services. So what we found out really is through conversation and through that broader engagement is that some of our systems, when primary care practitioners are considering referring an individual into secondary care, the referral process is one of stratifying.
Mm.
So we're having to do that work as well now to think, okay, that's not what we want to do, you know, but
Yeah.
so having to look at those systems that bridge primary care and secondary care as well.
Mm.
So
Mm.
some challenges around keeping the MDT working in place, the bridge between primary and secondary care.
Mm.
I suppose keeping the energy going, really
Yeah.
important. We are in a busy mental health environment, just making sure that we maintain focus and energy around this particular important improvement.
Absolutely. And that having a common language is so important, isn't it? And
Yeah.
a language that is inclusive to all all professionals,
Yeah.
and all people is really important. Helps everybody to be on the same page, but also differentiate what their roles are within the task. So
Absolutely.
really interesting, really interesting. Well, if there's any hope to be given, even over the last 12 months or 2 years since even the NICE guidance was released, I've seen in practice a significant shift towards that more holistic approach. So hopefully this piece of guidance will push that along even more. So Seamus, thank you so much for your time. An absolute pleasure. And yeah, hopefully speak to you again soon. Thank you, Seamus. This guidance is all about changing practice, and it will be important that we continue to focus on this shift in practice and supporting change. Speaking of focus, one person who has focused on suicide prevention through impactful research for nearly 50 years is Professor Keith Hawton. Keith is a professor of psychiatry and Emeritus Director of the Centre for Suicide Research at Oxford University. Until recently, in 2023, he was a consultant psychiatrist at Oxford NHS Trust. His work has led to the development of the multi-centre study of self-harm in England, and his work with Dr. Karen Lascelles underpins the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance. I was quietly humbled to take this recording with him.
Some of the background to the development of the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance. And the title of my presentation is that which we use a paper published 2.5 years ago now, a group of us relating to the need for a different approach to suicide prevention, and particularly to the assessment of clinical intervention patients. But before doing so, I'd just like to set the context of what we're talking about here in the broader context of suicide prevention. We're focusing very much on clinical interventions with individual patients, but we need to remind ourselves that in terms of thinking more broadly about suicide prevention, we don't need to think just about the focus on individual patients, but also the measures that we need to do and governments need to do in order to prevent suicide in a more upstream way. In other words, public health interventions. And this is something a group of us had written about recently in a series of papers in Lancet Public Health. But returning to the specific topic, there are facts about suicide risk that are an important basis for the development of the new guidance. And I'd like to go through these briefly. In the United Kingdom, people who die by suicide, which is sadly approximately 6,000 individuals per year, we know that somewhere between 25 and 30% have been in contact with psychiatric services at the time of death, or have been in the year beforehand. And therefore, it's entirely logical to try to predict those patients most at risk. But the fundamental problem, and indeed the reason really for the development of the guidance, is that suicide risk prediction largely does not work. So let's consider some of the evidence for this in terms of what we know about prediction of suicide. Aspect is of people who died by suicide, how many had indicated that they were thinking about it beforehand. And I'm going to refer here to a report from the National Confidential Inquiry in which clinicians have recorded their impressions of suicide risk in patients who've subsequently sadly gone on to die by suicide. And based on data collected over a long period, so a very large number of people who sadly die by suicide, the clinicians indicated that it was thought by those caring for the patients that at the last service contact, suicide risk was either low or absent in 85% of cases. So the vast majority, and even in terms of longer term risk, nearly 60% of cases, it was thought that this risk was low or absent. So there's a lot of other evidence, a lot of other studies that have been done internationally that have come up with similar findings. I just mentioned one of them, much smaller study from the USA of 132 patients who died by suicide within 30 days of being clinically evaluated. And in these patients, 2/3 denied suicidal intent when last asked, and half of these died within 2 days of being asked. So asking about suicidal intention as a predictor of whether people are going to die by suicide is very reliable. And why is this? Why do patients deny they're thinking about suicide, even though they may go on to die by suicide subsequently? Well, there's some reasons listed here. They may fear being judged negatively by clinicians if they admit to suicidal thoughts. They may not fully have understood the question that was being asked. It may have been asked in a manner which encouraged a negative response, such as, you're not thinking of harming yourself, are you? They may have feared that if they admitted to suicidal thoughts, then there would be more restrictive psychiatric intervention, even perhaps being put on a Mental Health Act section. Or they may not have wanted to be prevented from carrying out a suicidal act. But probably the most likely reason was that they weren't actually suicidal at the time. Suicidal ideas are often brief and fluctuating. For example, in a series of patients who'd attempted suicide, nearly half of them thought about they said they thought about the actual act for 10 minutes or less before actually engaging in it. And we found similar results in studies we've done. In a study where patients who had attempted suicide in the previous year and were in mental health care, or mental health care patients admitted because of suicidal ideation who were assessed repeatedly over several days and more than once a day, that it was found that their thoughts of suicide varied dramatically over the course of most days, as did their recordings of hopelessness, burdensomeness, and loneliness, all of which are relevant to suicide. The problem here is that in clinical practice, if a patient does not say they have thoughts of suicide at the time they're asked, the suicide risk assessment may end simply no SI, no suicidal ideation, and therefore the risk may be formulated as either none or low. And most importantly, their clinical priority may be recorded as low. And this may have very damaging effects in terms of their subsequent progress. What about prediction using specific risk scales? There have been large numbers of studies of risk scales, predictive scales, and systematic reviews of such scales. But the conclusion from all of these studies, and particularly where they've been reviewed cumulatively, is that they largely don't work. Their positive predictive value is usually about 5%, which means they're wrong 95% of the time. While it's true that more suicides occur in a group identified as high risk by such scales, or somewhat more patients in those groups die, most suicides will occur in the much larger group of patients at low or moderate risk. As a result of this work, the UK NICE self-harm guideline published in 2022 ended with these important recommendations. Do not use risk assessment measures and scales to predict future suicide or repetition of self-harm. Do not use such scales to determine who should be offered treatment or who should be discharged. And don't use global risk stratification, in other words, the traffic light sort of system, into grouping people into low, medium, or high risk to predict future suicide or repetition, or to determine who should be offered care. So what is it that drives this the preoccupation that clinical services have had with risk prediction? Well, one, of course, is the sense that one ought to be able to predict who's at risk, but I've already demonstrated that doesn't seem to work. But hospital organizations, mental health trusts and so on have tended to demand that risk prediction is done. Regulatory agencies may also emphasize the importance of this. Coroners and similar agencies, such as in Scotland, may demand that a risk assessment was done, or ask, was a risk assessment done, as if this somehow makes a difference when the patient has actually died. And of course, clinicians may well hang on to use of risk prediction measures because of it providing a sense of control, albeit a false one. What are the alternatives approaches to risk management? And this is very much the basis of the development of the staying safe from suicide guidance. The first is recognizing that risk prediction is a fallacy, as I hope I've shown. And the second is to adopt what one might call a more population approach to prevention. By this we mean recognizing that we can't predict who specifically is at risk, but if we can deliver a sort of safer clinical intervention that focuses on keeping people safe, that involves families and so on, then we will hopefully prevent more suicides, albeit that we can't identify who specifically is most at risk. And in doing so, obviously, one needs to focus on the therapeutic aspects of clinical management much more than thinking primarily about who is at risk, who's not at risk, thinking what one can offer to patients that is likely to help them and also keep them safe. And of course, use of safety planning, which has now been incorporated in practice in trusts throughout the country. And indeed, there's relatively good evidence that safety planning can be beneficial. This study highlighted here was a review of a number of trials done of safety planning, showing that it can be associated with reduced suicidal behavior in people who receive it compared with those who don't. So these facts are, I think, the basis for the development of the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance. Hopefully with this sort of more general approach to clinical management focused on helping reduce risk, some suicides will be prevented in our patient population. So thanks very much for listening.
Yes, Keith, let's hope and continue to work together so there are less lives lost to suicide. Keith has given us an excellent evidence-based case for change, and our next guest will depict what this looks like in practice. Dr. Karen Lascelles has more than 35 years of experience as a mental health nurse with a keen clinical and research focus on self-harm and suicide for over a decade. She is now a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University. Her recently published professional doctorate focused on experiences and needs of those providing informal care to adults in suicide crisis. And if you haven't already watched it, I can highly recommend an interview I did with Karen about this topic. Today, Karen talks to us about shifting from prediction to therapeutic assessment, formulation, and safety management. I really hope you enjoy this presentation as much as I did.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about the application of the principles from the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance and other guidance around therapeutic assessment in practice, particularly the shift towards formulation away from stratification of risk. And I suppose one of the things for me that's so important in this guidance is that it really talks about the dynamic nature of formulation. It's not a one-off exercise. The formulation stays with the patient over time, and by using the principles of formulation, both the clinician and the patient, and where possible, family members develop a deeper understanding of that individual's needs and what safety means to them and how we can better support safety. And alongside that, I think what's really important is the whole change in language from risk to safety. It's more than just a word, it's the whole kind of attitude surrounding safety. It's a much more hopeful and positive way to work with our client group, rather than having that sort of risk attitude where we tend to sort of become quite risk adverse. So a dynamic safety formulation really helps us identify individual needs, and that obviously helps us develop meaningful and feasible care plans and safety plans with our patients. It's an intervention in and of itself, and the assessment is a gateway to ongoing engagement with mental health services. So the therapeutic relationship is so important and fundamental to that. And I think we talk about the therapeutic relationship a lot, and we all understand how important it is. But I think that we need to continue to be reflexive about it. It doesn't matter how many years we've been in practice, being mindful about the therapeutic relationship and whether or not we're fully present in the assessment and formulation with our patients is really important. And that means being mindful of what we're thinking and what we're feeling, as well as what the patient is saying and thinking and feeling, so that we know we're in their frame of reference and we're fully present for them. So these sort of this brief list is some of the key components of the therapeutic relationship. Genuine compassion, authenticity. Without authenticity, we're not really going to hear the story in the way the patient needs us to hear it. Setting the scene for assessments is so important. Is the person comfortable? Do they need some water? Are you in a safe place? Is it quiet enough? Is it private enough? And being very candid from the outset about the possibility of difficult questions within the assessment and formulation. Some of what I ask you might seem a bit odd, some of it might feel uncomfortable, and some of it might seem a little bit invasive, but explaining why we're asking the questions that we're asking. And if we start with this person's story, if we start by asking them to tell us their story, what's happened that's led to them being with you here today, you're much more able to pick up on the on relevant cues in order to ask the questions, and therefore your questions are going to fit with the story so much better and be easier for the individual to answer. And obviously our non-verbal communication is so important, and within the assessment, as well as trying to identify what somebody's needs are, we need to have a strengths-based approach so that we're picking up throughout the assessment signs of that individual's strengths, their attributes, because we can draw on these when we get to safety planning to help them think about qualities that they have as an individual that might help them alleviate distress and mitigate against suicidal crises in the future. Asking about suicide is, of course, a really important part of formulation and thinking about safety. And I think we know nowadays that when we're talking with our patients about suicide, there isn't really any room for ambiguity. Having sort of flimsy questions about, you know, you're going to harm yourself, do you not want to be here anymore, isn't necessarily going to give us the information we need. It might be interpreted very differently by different individuals. So there has to be an element of directness to our questioning. We have to be on the same page. That said, sort of concrete questions or discrete questions about presence and absence of suicidal thoughts alone or suicidal intent alone isn't enough. We need to frame our questions in a much more open way so that we can reveal the feelings beneath the suicidal thoughts, so we can understand what suicide means to the person in front of us, we can understand what the drivers are, and we can sort of understand the mechanisms really. So we mustn't fall into that trap of, you know, have you got suicidal thoughts? Have you got a plan? Are you going to act on them? Those are questions that we need to ask, but they've got to be within the context of a compassionate and curious conversation that focuses on feelings. And so this is where the empathy is so important. And David Jobes, who developed the collaborative assessment and management of suicide model, talks about empathizing with the suicidal wish whilst maintaining a prevention bias. And what this means is that we convey you know, a genuine understanding of how somebody has reached a point in their life that their psychological pain is so unbearable they're contemplating ending their life. And yet the prevention bias is around reasonable hope, a hope that's mindful in the here and now and is about the possibility that things could change. It's not an overly optimistic hope that don't worry, everything's going to be fine. But it is, you're with me now, so maybe that gives us an opportunity to work towards hope and to work towards alternatives. So the balance between empathy and prevention is really, really central to working well with people who have suicidal thoughts and behaviours. Empathy is another word that we use a lot in mental health services, but it is important that we understand the variants of empathy when we're working with our suicidal patients. So it's made up really of, you know, affective empathy, which is that emotional resonance where we feel the patient's distress. And this is so important because it's that affective empathy that influences our sort of non-verbal responses, our facial mimicry and our body language, ensuring that it's congruent with the story that we're hearing from our patients. The drawbacks of affective empathy, though, for clinicians can be empathic distress, where we become distressed by hearing the individual's stories. If we're taking on too many feelings or we're remembering too many feelings that we might have of our own. And also emotional contagion, which is where we adopt the patient's distress and we can kind of become a bit confused and we lose what's known as the self-other distinction. And that self-other distinction is so important because without it, we're not really going to be able to work effectively as clinicians with our patients. So as important as effective empathy is, we need to be careful that we don't get too lost in our own feelings that we have in response to the patient. And this is where cognitive empathy comes in. So cognitive empathy is where we draw on our knowledge and our knowledge that may come from an understanding of psychological models of suicide, perhaps, and our knowledge that also comes from working with many patients over our clinical professional years that's given us that sort of experiential knowledge. So cognitive empathy is really important, but on its own, without an element of emotional resonance, it might mean that an over-reliance on it results in a dispassionate stance that patients might find difficult because they're not going to be telling their stories to someone who seems distant to them. So empathic validation is kind of like the middle ground. It draws on both affective empathy and cognitive empathy, but encourages us not to get too lost in the feelings of the deep distress, rather understanding it, but also feeling the need for somebody to feel understood, feeling the need for somebody to be heard, and being able to validate their deep psychological pain that's led to them contemplating suicide. So this empathic stance is central to effective formulation of safety needs. And this is to sort of pad out, to get a fuller picture, we really need to understand, all of the circumstances and experiences that somebody has gone through. And this is one approach to trying to gather that bigger picture by keeping an eye out in the story of the patient is telling us for the predisposing, modifiable, future and protective factors. And when we ask our questions throughout the story or following the story, we can frame them to ensure we get this bigger picture. None of the lists that you can see on this diagram are exhaustive. They're examples. But the predisposing factors are those historic factors, things that have happened to an individual that might mean they have an inherent vulnerability to suicidal crises in the context of distress or these modifiable factors, such as changes in social circumstances or deterioration in mental health, and so on. The modifiable factors are changeable, and our interventions often are focused on these modifiable factors to try and alleviate them so that somebody can sort of stabilise and become safer. The future factors are those anticipated factors, things that might be ahead of somebody, difficult times, difficult situations, that we know are going to happen. And the importance of understanding those is that we can plan together with the patient and, where possible, their family member to try and mitigate against future suicidal crises. So it's really important in safety planning to understand what some of these future factors might be. And then, of course, we've got strengths and protective factors. So protective factors are not just interpersonal. They're not just about family, friends, or who to call when you're struggling. It's about people's internal strengths. These might be problem-solving skills. It might be spirituality. It might be creativity. It might be insight, or it might be an ability to hold on to realistic, reasonable hope. And so the aim really of the formulation is to assimilate all of this information and understand with the person we're working with what their warning signs might be in the future to try and prevent ongoing suicidal crises. But in the here and now, using this approach really helps us make sense of an individual's sort of crisis pathway, if you like. So here's an example. If you're working with somebody and you start off perhaps with those hearing their story and then really sort of thinking about these modifiable factors that have contributed to the current crisis, we might be able to work out together what's happened. So here, for example, somebody has had pressure at work, which has led to stress and poor sleep and a downturn in mood and feelings of irritability, which in turn have resulted in interpersonal conflict. And because of that, the person has started to withdraw. And their alcohol use, as you can see from the wine glasses, has sort of increased over that time. And the combination of that has resulted in negative thinking, psychological pain, and subsequently suicidal ideation. So we can achieve this shared understanding of how this crisis happened by bringing in the predisposing factors, the historic factors. We can help somebody understand why they might be vulnerable to developing suicidal thoughts in these kinds of situations. And by focusing also on the future factors, we can help that person and, wherever possible, a family member or carer, understand when they might be vulnerable in the future. And if someone understands when they're vulnerable, they're much more likely to be able to take steps to avoid future crises. And reflecting on suicidal crisis helps us understand where interventions might be helpful. So this is because they're modifiable factors, therefore interventions can modify. And the red arrows in this picture sort of depict points at which intervention might have been helpful, and we can learn from that for future crises. The other thing that this approach helps us do is address individual needs in the short and the medium term. So by getting a good understanding of the crisis pathway, what's led to the suicidal crisis, and understanding the contributory factors, it enables us to identify short-term and longer-term interventions. And I think it's really important if when we're seeing somebody, particularly if it might be only once in an A&E setting, for example, that somebody can leave that assessment with at least one thing that helps them in the short term, because that helps with the reasonable hope. So, for example, it may be that the immediate things that we can perhaps work on are sleep. We might be able to give somebody a short-term prescription to address their insomnia. We might be able to have a brief counselling around reduction of alcohol use. We might be able to think about connection and how can we help you feel connected over the next few days to try and alleviate your sense of loneliness, and of course reducing access to means. And then some of the longer term interventions, which need to be evidence-based wherever possible, include things like brief CBT for suicidal behaviour, which is in line with the NICE guidelines. Or it might be longer term work, for example, psychological interventions for eating disorders or bereavement counselling. Continuity of care is important, and wherever possible, if we can have the same clinician working with somebody, it's great and it's ideal. Obviously, in today's world, that isn't always possible, but continuity of care is not just about the person, it's also about the formulation. And by developing a formulation that follows the patient, we should avoid these scenarios whereby somebody is assessed over and over again by different clinicians in their care. A formulation deepens over time as you develop an increased understanding of a person and the factors that sort of lead to them becoming vulnerable. But it's not snakes and ladders. We don't need to go down and start the assessment again every time. So continuity of care is about the formulation following the patient. The other intervention that we need to consider with all of our patients is safety planning. And I think we're all quite familiar with safety planning nowadays. It's important to remember that safety planning isn't necessarily going to be effective mid-crisis. Safety planning is about reflecting on previous crises. So someone's got to be in a position that they're able to engage well in safety planning. In an emergency situation, a safety planning might actually be carried out with somebody's family member or other professionals if they're not able to safety plan themselves. And then the deeper collaborative owned safety plan might be developed a bit later on. But it is a reflective piece of work whereby we work with somebody to revisit those crisis pathways and understand warning signs and triggers so that we can develop strategies together to help them try and mitigate against future crises. I think we're quite familiar with the 6 phases of safety planning: warning signs and triggers, individual internal coping strategies when somebody's alone, how they can feel connected and distract themselves from suicidal thoughts, not by talking about them, but perhaps by transcending them, really. And then social support when they're struggling, and then professional support, and obviously making the environment safe. But safety planning isn't necessarily a linear process. We might need to go back and forth between those steps in the same way we would do within a formulation to ensure that a safety plan is meaningful, possible and feasible. Another component of safety planning that we need to remember is contingency dialogue. So, for example, if somebody has identified a friend who they are going to contact when they're struggling, it's perhaps important to have a conversation about how that person might feel and what they might think if their friend doesn't answer the phone. Because often people will say, well, if she doesn't answer the phone, I think that will probably mean she doesn't want to help, she's had enough of me, and I will feel abandoned, and I will feel alone, and I will feel worthless. So as part of our safety planning, we need to have that conversation about what other reasons might there be for that person not answering the phone. Is it feasible that maybe they're in the shower, or they're driving, or they're at work, or their batteries run out? And what's your backup plan? If they don't answer the phone, perhaps give yourself some time to work out with them what the reason for that is, and what can you do whilst you wait to call them again. Is there someone else you can call, or is there something you can do for half an hour and then call again? Back to family and friends. If family and friends are identified as part of a safety plan, it's important they know that, and they know what the expectations of them are, and they have a think themselves about whether or not they can meet those expectations. So it goes back to the point that family and friends are a really important resource in both formulation and safety planning that we should involve where possible. So in conclusion, we know now that suicide risk prediction doesn't work. And so the shift needs to be, and this is what the Staying Safe guidance is trying to do, is shift the emphasis from risk to a dynamic therapeutic approach, and that should say dynamic safety formulation rather than risk formulation, because we're changing that language and we're changing that emphasis to safety. Of course, there are some barriers to sort of implementation, really, and here's some challenges that we might experience in practice. You know, if we're working in teams that are you know, quite reliant on, say, risk stratification, and we're socialised into that way of working, it can be difficult to change those behaviours. It might not be a quick win, if you like, and certainly training is going to be essential, and supervision, to enable us to make those changes. Similarly, the expectations of organisations and coroners sometimes, and perhaps families, you know, we need to help them have realistic expectations of what formulation is, what safety is, and what mental health professionals are able to do to support that. We all know how few resources we've got at the moment, and it is challenging. And in emergency situations, when we've got to think on our feet, it might be difficult to sit down and do a big formulation, but the principles still apply. Even if you're in an emergency, or you're doing a triage call, or a brief online triage, the principles that I've talked about and that are in the Staying Safe guidance still apply. And remember that formulation is a gradual thing. We build on formulation over time. It's not really going to necessarily all be done in the first meeting. And then lastly, the electronic patient records. This is my personal bugbear as a clinician, that we do need to develop our electronic systems to help us effectively and quickly record the information that we need to record, and to ensure that it's easily accessible to everybody who might be involved in our patients' care. So, you know, there's a way to go to try and implement this approach smoothly and seamlessly into practice. But there's so much evidence underpinning the approaches highlighted in the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance. And hopefully I've outlined some helpful tips for practice to help us along the way as clinicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and certainly an inspiring presentation there. And lots of really useful tips for those of you in practice. So I hope you've got a lot out of that presentation, as I did. The next person that I invited, or we invited to present, is one of Storm's training consultants. He's also the clinical lead for Crew's bereavement service, and has his own counselling private practice. So I was quite interested to hear what Andy Langford had to say about what the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance meant for these roles that he has. Over to you, Andy.
There you go. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint there. This is just the introductory slide, so I'm just going to go on to the next one. So just a bit more of an introduction, really. So as I say, my name's Andy Langford. Now, I've been a Storm facilitator for a number of years, worked with different versions of Storm. and also have a number of other capacities that I operate in. So I've been involved for over 25 years working in various settings around vulnerability with a number of different client groups. I work as a private practitioner myself as a psychotherapist, which I'm qualified and accredited, and the majority of my work is online. I also do a lot of work around voice-only support. And finally, I'm also a clinical director nationally for Cruise Bereavement Support, and that's the UK's largest national bereavement support charity covering England, Northern Ireland and Wales. Now, we're going to look at it's really 6 sections within the guidance that have particular applicability for people in private practice and for people working in charities and also those charities providing support to vulnerable individuals. I'll also cover some aspects about the guidance that are directly applicable to charities. And these are the 6 here. We've got the need for change, overarching principles, safety assessment and formulation, particularly elements 1 and 2. Then following that, safety management and planning, so element 3, the importance of language, and finally, guidance for organisations. So in terms of, firstly, looking at capabilities and capacities, I want to particularly focus on the first one, which is around governance. This applies mostly to individual organisations. So in terms of governance, we've got sort of 3 key elements for, really here. So organisations have responsibilities around supporting people presenting as vulnerable. Okay, that's the first thing really to bear in mind. And also, there's a responsibility that organisations have to itself and its own governance. So all within an organisation have a role to play in reducing risk and the need to take this reducing of risk really seriously. And thirdly, there's a responsibility to the practitioners that are employed and also volunteer for those organisations. Okay, so secondly, what you've got is individual learning. And this is around particularly individuals within organisations and individuals that practice on their own. So, what we need to think about here is the importance of developing knowledge. So being aware of the guidance, also being aware of different conversation and action models and how to deploy them. And finally, being practical and how the applicability of the guidance is important for your individual practice. So then we get on the need to change, really, and there's 2 main elements I'll pull out here. Firstly, the importance of understanding the low risk paradox. So what the guidance talks about is that the evidence indicates that we as practitioners are substantially at risk of underestimating risk. So what this means is that not everyone who is at risk of suicide actually presents as being substantially at risk. In fact, most people at risk who die by suicide are often initially assessed as low or no risk. Having a very formulaic approach to risk assessment for suicide doesn't work. We need to have an understanding of the importance of holistic, compassionate, and relational approaches. That's firstly the importance of understanding that low risk paradox. Secondly, the idea of systemic change. Now, we all know that people are complex and facets of a person relate to each other. We know this very, very clearly. How we experience ourselves psychologically influences our experience of being in our own bodies and also how we interact socially. Whether working in private practice or in charities, we often find ourselves in contact with many different needs and vulnerabilities. We get to see how these needs complicate and sometimes reinforce each other. Being aware of how to conceptualize risk of suicide is vital. This is particularly the case when we consider that many folk who experience suicidal thoughts are not necessarily presenting with them overtly in the first instance. A conversation is needed. What the learning tells us is that underlies the guidance is that we all have a part to play, no matter our role. We then come on to looking at overarching principles. Now, there is direct synergy between the 10 overarching key principles of the guidance with the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy's research review into suicide risk when working in counselling professions. Notably, the learning from the research review is applicable to many professionals that work directly with the psychological aspects of a person and also to professionals that employ counselling skills to engage with that work with people, with the aim of helping them increase functionality and essentially better live their lives. Both emphasise the importance of building safety and trust, collaboration, safety as part of a broad understanding of a person's life, the importance of planning, and also involving others and not working in a silo, a common danger when working independently or as part of a small team or charity. Next, we get onto 5 main areas that are covered in the guidance around safety assessment and formulation. I'll just cover each of those briefly to highlight them. So firstly, we've got the importance of collaboration, and that is between the professional and the person they are concerned about who may be at risk of suicide. So not adopting an interviewing or a prescriptive approach necessarily. Secondly, alliance and rapport. So that's building alliance and rapport. The relationship forms the basis, the foundation of how we can build to understand what a person wants and needs. Thirdly, initial assessment. The importance of having a structure or in some ways a shape to the conversation that is purposeful and at the same time shows empathy. Fourthly, working alone. We make judgments based on clinical knowledge and experience. However, having a model by which to ground these views is so important. It's vital. This needs to twin with collaboration. The vulnerable person's and the practitioner's views are needed. Also, the guidance indicates that having an integrated approach to working with other professionals and non-formal means of support is key. The impact on the practitioner as well, lastly. The BACP research review specifically highlights anxiety, anger, frustration, and protectiveness as core common experiences arising in professionals when working with suicide risk. Having a good practice model with clear and key elements that tell us how to engage with suicide risk is vital. Practicing in an evidence-based way is more sustainable to the practitioner. It's not just on me or you solely. Our interventions are based then on sound research. And then next, we have aspects of safety management and planning. So first off, managing risk. The evidence indicates that engagement in therapeutic support helps people manage risk. So it's important that we all know how to have a conversation about suicide risk. Secondly, reducing attempts or improving functioning. Equally, evidence indicates that the same engagement can, when employed in an evidence-based conversation model that has safety planning as its objective, can reduce suicide attempts and improve functioning and resilience for the client. Thirdly, the importance of alliance. The importance of planning together between the practitioner and the client. This creates a means of demonstrating collaboration and is also underpinned by collaboration itself, creating a virtuous loop. It communicates that you are valued to the person. Fourthly, we've got the importance of trusted people. That is, involving those who are supportive of the client at risk. It is evidently more likely to produce better outcomes and reduce risk if those people are included as opposed to if they're not. It is also more sustainable for practitioners if people who are trusted are included in someone's support. And finally here, other services. So ensuring we do not work in silos. It's so important for the benefit of the client at risk of suicide and also for ourselves and our own sustainability again. This all fosters more hope, once again, for those at risk and also for us as practitioners. And then what we've got is a section on the importance of language. Now, the language guide in the new NHS guidance, whilst brief, is deliberately so. It's a clear set of guiding principles that are trauma-informed. This guidance can help shape our language with clients and also help us convey that what we need to in ways that brings about a higher likelihood of collaboration. This helps reduce risk. If we create an environment in which clients feel supported and not judged, conveying that we genuinely care and that they are valued, clients are more likely to feel safe to disclose what's going on for them. What we are doing here is working with someone to bring down the walls of shame and stigma that may have been experienced over time. Use of language is so important. We then get on to guidance for organisations. Now, these elements are important for individual practitioners. They are also entirely relevant for organisations. This is important for charities. So within the guidance are named key aspects of how an organisation can shape culture and develop governance so that practice is as safe as it can be, considering the endemic risk of working with vulnerability and people who are vulnerable. So what we've got in here is around shaping culture. This includes elements such as language that connects people, staying safe language, so adopting a personal and curious approach that is conveyed through language, using the right language for someone and not using checklists, also engaging with family and support networks, and also changing away from stratified risk assessment protocols. And then finally, we could also think about building effective governance models that includes leadership and strategy, training and practitioner support, adopting a narrative approach to recording, tracking progress over time, and also endorsement of the guidance itself. That's important when we're thinking about how we fold the guidance into the governance structures that we've got in organisations. These are essential building blocks that develop safer practice. The evidence tells us that they ultimately save lives. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. What we've covered is sections of the guidance that are key, overarching principles, safety assessment and formulation, safety management and planning, the importance of language, and also guidance for organisations. I hope that this overview about how the guidance applies directly to individual practitioners and also to charities too has been helpful. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy. It was really helpful to see some of the components of the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance and also how they apply specifically to charities and those working in private practice. Our next guests are Rosie Ellis and Jess Worner. Rosie is the executive lead of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, and Jess is their lived experience manager for the National Suicide Prevention Alliance. I invited them both to have a conversation with each other about what the guidance means for the NSPA, for NSPA members, but also those with lived experience. So let's take a look at their conversation. Thank you.
My name's Rosie Ellis. I'm the executive lead of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, which is effectively a cross-sector network. So we work with organisations across the public, private and voluntary sector, and we're all about supporting good practice in suicide prevention.
Hiya, I'm Jess. I am the Lived Experience Network Manager at NSPA, and I work with lots of people with personal lived experience related to suicide to influence, shape, inform, and make an impact on suicide prevention activity across sectors. So we've got we're having a bit of a chat between ourselves, aren't we? So we've got a few questions that we're going to ask each other to talk about the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance. So Rosie, I think I've got a question I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think the Staying Safe from Suicide guidance can mean for NSPA members who work with people experiencing suicidality? And also what could that mean for the wider suicide prevention community?
So thanks, Jess. I think the first thing to highlight is that this isn't just aimed at mental health professionals within statutory services like the NHS. It's aimed at practitioners across the public, private and voluntary sectors. And I think that's really important because I feel that it recognises the importance of ensuring consistent standards and levels of care when it comes to supporting someone who's suicidal, no matter who they're in contact with and what part of the system they're being supported by. So I think, you know, and given that we are a cross-sector network and we know we've got lots of voluntary and community sector members, I would say this guidance is really relevant to all, really. I think it's an excellent resource for helping think through how we have conversations with someone who is suicidal. So to help us understand the extent of their suicidal feelings, what support might be needed, understanding each person's unique situation and context, and collaboratively discussing how to help them stay safe. So I think this is an incredibly useful piece of guidance to help kind of unpack and think through, because these conversations aren't necessarily easy to have. And I think on the basis of how comprehensive the guidance is, I would say that I think it's really useful for community groups and organisations who may be coming into contact with people who are suicidal. It might be that not all bits of the guidance you would use if you're running some sort of community group, but I would definitely encourage lots of different organisations and people to take a look at it. So they're kind of my key thoughts in terms of what it means for the suicide prevention community. Jess, I guess we often talk about lived experience involvement and co-production, but what does this mean in the context of suicide prevention, and how does this guidance link with that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to put it really simply, lived experience involvement is about genuinely involving people in decisions that, in the decisions that affect our lives. And co-production is, takes that further and is about working together in real partnership and having an equal say in how, services, strategies, policy, all kinds of activity around suicide prevention is done and produced together. And I understand that this guidance itself was developed with a lived experience group, and that's great. And it really does show, actually, reading the guidance, you can really see that. And I think the guidance is hugely relevant because, at an SPA, we might be seeking to embed lived experience expertise at a practice or strategic or policy level. I think it's also vital that this is mirrored at that individual level in terms of people's own support. Like you can't be calling for lived experience involvement and co-production at that sort of systems level if that's not happening for people's own, when people are accessing support themselves. So yeah, I think it's really vital that that's mirrored, and I'd say collaborative safety planning that is genuinely person-centered really does put someone at the forefront of their own care and support, rather than being passive recipients where things are sort of done to us. So I think that's about really, taking the time to understand what works for someone, understanding that suicidality looks really different for each person and their context. So then seeing someone as an expert in themselves, and sort of working together with someone to plan their own support, like that goes hand in hand with lived experience involvement and co-production, really. And I guess thinking about that, though, there's lots of opportunities and challenges, and I've got a few thoughts about that in terms of lived experience involvement and co-production. But Rosie, what challenges and opportunities do you think the publication of this guidance brings to suicide prevention?
Yeah, I actually was just going to jump back and just say something to follow on from your point about that kind of person-centered and approach, and really thinking about an individual's context and situation. That I think, when we recognize that there are so many sort of different factors that can lead a person to feel suicidal, and we speak in suicide prevention about the needs of different communities. I think one of the really important things about this guidance is that flexibility, then, that you're really meeting an individual where they are and actually trying to understand their situation, which is going to be very different depending on the individual. So I kind of just had that thought came into my mind as you were talking there. But I think in terms of challenges and opportunities, there are a couple of things. I do think there's an opportunity for us to open up more conversations with practitioners and professionals about how they work with patients and clients to assess safety. I think we do need to recognise that the research around this has been clear for quite some years, and we know that actually the good practice around assessing safety has not been implemented. So fantastic to have guidance like this to really help people think through how to do this. But let's have a conversation about what are the barriers, and what's helpful about this guidance, how's it working in practice, and maybe just recognise that this isn't easy, not least for that individual who is going through a difficult time and feeling suicidal, but actually opening up those conversations with practitioners about how it is for them as well, and how we can continue to take this guidance, build on it, and really make sure that it's being implemented. Which leads me to, I guess, my reflection around the sort of challenge in this area is exactly that. We've got this guidance now. How is it implemented? How are we ensuring that it's followed? And particularly, I guess there are maybe more levers for ensuring that implementation when we're thinking about the NHS, but actually when we're talking about private practice and other areas, it can be more difficult. So I think there's something about we will need to think about that challenge of implementation moving forward to ensure that this really does get out there and actually it's doing what we want it to. So yeah, Jess, what are your thoughts about the challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what you've said. But I think there's something, I mean, I'm often talking about the importance of nuance, particularly, I speak to and spend time with lots of other people. I have personal lived experience myself, but also spend a lot of time with other people with lived experience, particularly in our network. And so many experiences are different, and people have different perspectives around suicide, around what their context is. And I think that the opening up for like a more nuanced conversation around how we approach suicide and experiences of suicidality, I really hope and think that this guidance can help with that as well. Because I think taking a person-centered approach does allow for that kind of nuance where people are working with an individual person and giving somebody space to lead their support, plan for their safety, but also think about what makes sense to them. And that allows for plurality and different experiences. But I think that can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Like, it can be complicated, it can be messy as well. And there's a challenge there too. So there's a challenge that maybe there's, if it's actually, rather than trying to predict risk in a stratified way, we need to work with people in a person-centered way to plan for safety. Sometimes that can lead to, feelings of powerlessness or less sort of certainty. And I think there's something about opening up space to kind of explore those potential feelings of discomfort as well, for things to be kind of true, for guidance to be truly embedded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely does. Yeah.
And I guess thinking about that, and I think there's been some themes to this conversation, but if there was one thing you would hope to see happen or change as a result of this guidance, what would that be, Rosie?
I mean, I think it probably goes back to that one of the points that I made in the first question around just the importance of consistent and sort of consistent standards of support that people receive. And I guess recognizing that, I think everybody working in this space, we want to support and help when when we're supporting somebody who is suicidal, and actually ensuring that people receive a consistent and safe level of support is so important. So I think the more we can kind of get all practitioners kind of working in a way that's safe. That's the most important thing, I think.
Absolutely.
What about you, Jess? What's your thought on one thing you would like to see change?
I mean, I guess to put it quite simply, it is for people experiencing suicidality to be listened to and supported in a way that is led by them with their needs and wishes at the forefront, really, which sounds quite obvious, but I think this is really what that guidance in a nutshell is calling for. So yeah, that's what I hope
It might seem obvious, but I think sometimes we can get a bit lost. We can lose sight of that, can't we?
Yeah.
Sometimes. So I think really important to bring us back to that.
Absolutely. Rosie, I just want to say, like, thank you for this conversation. I think it's been, I've personally found it really helpful to reflect on the guidance, and I hope people listening to this webinar have found it useful. And thank you everybody for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rosie and Jess. What a genuine and reflective conversation between you both. Very enjoyable. Thank you. And I really liked what was highlighted at the end in terms of making sure the needs and wishes of those thinking of suicide are held central and foremost in these conversations, and also acknowledging that that's not always easy, and lots of change needs to happen at lots of different levels for that good, safe practice to occur. So thank you both so much.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's just words on a page or words on a screen, so the intention obviously is to change practice, and that means implementation. So we're moving into the implementation phase. Seamus will probably be talking a bit about this as well, which is very important, where he's got a lot to contribute. So there are well over 250,000 mental health practitioners out there. The guidance is aimed at mental health practitioners. We've made it short. Yeah, it's only 14 pages before the 2 pages of reference, because we want it to be as accessible as possible to busy frontline practitioners. Right, and they're the ones who we want to read it, to understand it, and to change and adapt their practice in accordance with it. So implementation is going to be really, really important. So that's what we're going to be focused on in the next few months.
I was very mindful. From the very beginning, I was very mindful of our engagement with people with lived experience and our support network around them. And we thought we'd done everything as well as we could have done. But as the work progressed, we had some really sort of active, engaging experts by experience with us. They actually asked us to change the way we were engaging with them. And it was, we had to pause, and we had to set up something that looked a little bit different. But if I were to do it again, I would have a much earlier conversation with people with lived experience. Is what I was hearing back, engage us earlier on. We had something about, because we developed the guidance relatively quickly from sort of September till January, really. But the message from some service users was actually needing a bit more time to be giving feedback. Yeah. So if I was to do it again, I'd be thinking differently about time and feedback from people with lived experience. So if I was doing it different, I would have better engagement and think differently about engaging people with lived experience. Different. We ended up having, as you know, we had to. The previous guidance was 80-something pages, and we had about a limit of about 16 or 18 pages. My memory serves me well, but so we did have to curtail a lot of what we were saying, the section on safety assessment and formulation being part of a broader process. If I was doing it again, I'd probably try to reinforce that message about it is important that we do it really well, but it is part of a broader process. You know, the process of understanding somebody's life and what's happening, not just beyond potential thinking about self-harm or suicide, but some of that broader thinking. I think we've got it in the guidance, but if I was doing it again, I tried to probably reinforce that bit about it doesn't sit in isolation. This conversation doesn't sit in isolation. It's a much broader one. But that might be me, Bianca, being a bit tough. That second bit might be being a bit tough around how much more we could have fitted into it. But certainly the first element about more sensitivity to people with lived experience was a message that I got fairly early on, and definitely if I was doing it again in 2 or 3 years' time, I'm thinking, yes, I mustn't forget what people said about engagement. It was a particularly difficult, different and challenging ask to ask people to become engaged with this work stream because of the emotional things it's going to raise for many people. And these were people who put their hand up as people with lived experience, but quite a number of people on the working groups had their own personal and family experiences as well. So it's when you take that journey with people through something that's emotionally potentially quite difficult and challenging, I think there's a sensitivity needed there, and it's something that I hope we did at least 80%, 90% well, but next time it'll be a lot better.
Well, I don't think I would at this stage. I mean, as you indicated, you know, it's a very early stage in the rollout of this guidance. What I think is going to be really important is that we see how this works. First of all, in terms of clinician take-up, hospital take-up and clinician take-up. As I mentioned, it's going to be challenging moving to this more sort of general approach, if you like, to suicide prevention through therapeutic clinical management. But I do think that what we need to do is look at, first of all, how it's received by clinicians, and then also how it translates into care. And eventually, of course, one would like to see, you know, how effective it is. And that's going to be difficult because it's being rolled out nationally. And so to do an actual sort of clinical, you know, a trial, if you like, of its effectiveness is going to be challenging. But I do think that we need to really focus on how this gets rolled out, how accepted it is, and also look at it from patient points of view. It will be really interesting to have qualitative studies of how patients receive interventions based on the guidance.
I think that there's sort of two areas that I would think about are attended to in the guidance. And of course, you can't put everything you want to in guidance, otherwise it becomes, you know, just too long and people won't read it. So I don't think that the guidance has left these two issues out, but I'm particularly keen to think about the support of family and carers. I think the guidance talks about involvement really well, and you know, when it might be okay or not okay to involve family members, respecting confidentiality whilst promoting that involvement. And it does acknowledge that family members or carers will themselves be struggling. But actually, I think clinicians need to understand more about the responses that family members and carers have in order that they can communicate effectively with families and support them effectively and involve them effectively. So I feel like there needs to be some kind of companion resource really to help clinicians develop that understanding. And similarly, I think that again, the guidance says organisations and the implementation need to focus on the wellbeing of staff who are working with suicidality, which is great. But I think again, we need more about that. And this is where we are quite candid about the some of the consequences of working regularly with suicide and self-harm, and the impact that this can have on clinicians. So again, sort of a bit of a companion resource. And this is where we can draw things in, like a better understanding of empathy, how empathy can be affected by, repeated exposure, for example, to suicidal crises and so on, so that we can really inform clinicians in a way that validates the difficulties they might have, as well as just expecting them to always, know what to do. That makes sense.
I've got great belief in how much people can achieve, and I think it's all about having the focus and knowing, listen, so these are the things we've got. In the middle of our really busy lives, there are some things that are really important, and I think we just need to keep that focus for the next 2 or 3 years until we can think it's now much more embedded in quite a sustainable way in terms of people's practice.
Well, many researchers in this field related to suicide prevention, I focused a lot on risk factors for suicide, risks in particular groups such as people with certain psychiatric conditions, occupational groups that we know that are at risk, and so on and so forth. And I've done this over many years, and it's really only been in recent years that I think I and others have come to recognize that while such research is very interesting, and I think probably adds to our understanding of the mechanisms involved in the development of suicide in individuals, in terms of actual prevention at the individual patient level, this really doesn't work. And that's what I've tried to put in my presentation. And so to have this development of guidance across hospitals, in the country, I think is a great development. Is going to be, really very welcome. It's very challenging, I think, for people, for example, risk prediction measures and so on. But hopefully, this shift in thinking about prevention will mean that more people get delivered interventions that can be effective and also can help reduce risk of suicide. So one's hope is that this will translate into reduction of patient suicides, which of course has been a really major challenge for us for a long while.
I think what's so good about it is that it brings together in knowledge that's already known about the limitations in prediction and the importance of therapeutic formulation. It takes great steps towards changing the language from risk to safety, which reinforces what's already in the NICE guidance and elsewhere. And because it's led by NHS England, it's a trusted organisation. So hopefully NHS trusts will, be very ready to incorporate it into their training and into their strategy. And I think that the fact that NHS England are working on an implementation plan to support organisations to embed it will be really, really helpful. So it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of the word, NHS England is a good vehicle, I think, to make this an accessible way of working that trusts are more likely to sign up to than, academic journals alone, really. And it supports the NICE guidance, which is great. Yeah, I think it's about understanding the variance of empathy rather than just using it as a kind of all-inclusive term. And I think when we're kind of working with trainees, it's important that we break it down. So we ask the clinician about how they feel when they're working with suicidal patients, or we ask the clinician to take a bit of time to recall difficult feelings that they've had in the past, and how recalling them might be helpful, or how feeling them might be helpful in the context of working with suicidality. But at the same time, having a conversation about ensuring, that we develop the skills to keep that self-other distinction. And often that doesn't happen. You read a textbook and it says, oh yes, make sure that you take an empathic stance with your patient, and that's really as much as you see. And I don't think that everybody understands what effective resonance is. I don't think everybody understands that there will be all of these feelings in the room, and they can be very important and very valuable. So I do believe that people can be educated in what empathy is, and that education helps them perhaps to develop it themselves. Because, say, for example, if I'm having a day where I'm working with a patient and I'm feeling a bit vulnerable and a bit fragile myself, I'm going to have to be very careful about the level of effective empathy I bring into the room, because if I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm more likely to experience that emotional contagion. So on a day like that, I might really need to draw on that cognitive empathy for my own protection, because if I suffer that emotional contagion, it's going to be detrimental for the patient. And so some of that is just about, like I say, understanding the variants and applying them to ourselves and taking them into the kind of the clinical consultation, if you like. It isn't it's not an innate gift to be empathetic. It is something that we need to develop an understanding of in order to reach effectively. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think my understanding is that the 5 Ps was drawn on or incorporated into the Staying Safe guidance because it's a widely known approach to formulation. And I think the fact that many clinicians will be familiar with the 5 Ps was considered to be helpful in terms of, I guess, quickly being able to relate to what's being talked about in the guidance. So that's my understanding of that approach being used. As you say, it's really comparable. I think the varying formulation models have so much in common because they all strive for the same outcome. I think the model that we've drawn on really, which is underpinned by, professional clinical judgment, I like it because of the emphasis on the future factors, which whilst the 5 Ps, I'm sure incorporate, by saying future, it's just very specific. It really encourages the clinician to think ahead rather than maybe historic factors that have perpetuated suicidal crisis. It's thinking, so what's going on for this person hereafter that might result in vulnerability or might end up leading to a suicidal crisis. So I like the simplicity of it, and I like the way that it focuses on strengths as well as just protective factors, to really highlight that it's not all about interpersonal kind of protectiveness. It's about intrapersonal strengths that help somebody, develop the skills they need to stay safe.
Firstly, let's make sure we read it and we're aware of its contents. I know that might sound obvious, but we all get so much information and so many good practice pieces sent to us. It can at times be befuddling to know what to prioritise and focus on. However, this guidance is ultimately here to save lives. The research behind it is solid, and much is based on input from people with lived experience. If there's one piece of professional writing you need to read, it's this, if you haven't done so already. Secondly, the guidance is practical, so I'd advise you take a read through and start to think about how you can be prepared and be professionally curious. Think about how we can weave into our conversations questions about suicide when the need arises, so that you are best placed to be assessing for risk in this regard. Thirdly, Some therapy is more directional, and immediately overtly practical than others. However, no matter what school of therapy you are basing your practice on, we all need to be prepared to be clear and succinct when we get to planning with someone to maximise their safety. So it's important to be prepared to have the conversation about suicide and risk and be as clear as possible. So that's a really good question. The first thing we can do, all of us, is to be familiar with what the guidance says. Put simply, lots of people who are seeking help find that they disclose about thoughts of suicide in a supportive and collaborative conversation that was not initially labelled as a talk about suicide. People often need to feel safe and trust us before they disclose. So opportunities to have conversations about suicide and risk can come up at different points. So being prepared to be prepared to have the conversation is important. The other thing I would recommend is to point out something which once again may seem obvious, but is really important. The fact is, we are always assessing, perhaps not formally or in a structured a way as we would in an initial assessment, for instance, but we're always assessing. So being alert to some of the indicators when a client may be referring to suicidal thoughts is key. For example, talk of not wanting to carry on, listing hope, seeing no ways of moving forward or having dark thoughts, being ready to ask a bit more about these things. In terms of assessing and safety planning, one key element is to be prepared to clarify any ambiguities. Having clarity around risk is important. What's also vital is to have clear details that shape planning actions to mitigate risk. Think of SMART goals, that's important. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. Once again, this can seem quite different from how many of us do therapy. However, for the purpose of it mitigating risk around suicide, it's really important.
And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to each of our special guests for contributing. If you've not yet read the Staying Safe from Suicide Guidance, there's a link below. There's also a link to the NHS Resource Hub that you're welcome to join. We've also linked a resource that details how our training aligns with the new guidance. That's all from us for today. Have a lovely day. Thank you.